Welcome to this episode of Better Life Today. I am blessed to be joined by ASAP Ministries, and we have Lisa Eisensee and Lisa Budd here with us today. And we've talked to you before, and there's just so many stories. We wanted to talk a little bit more about how God engaged with you to reach a community probably completely unexpected. And Lisa, as we were talking, you were sharing about some of your first experiences, and I wanted to start with hearing some of those.
You know, I grew up interested in missions, reading lots of missions stories, and was interested in the persecuted church, those who were persecuted for their faith in Jesus. And yet it was really probably not until about 4 or 5 years ago, that I went over on my first mission trip with ASAP Ministries and met firsthand people that were persecuted for their faith. In fact, the very first ASAP missionary that they said, Pastor Lisa, we want you to interview this man because he was in prison for 4.5 years for being a Christian. And I just remember I was so jet lagged, and yet just like 4.5 years he spent in prison for being a Christian. And I could hardly wait to hear his story.
Right.
And so I sat down with him and his son knew English, and so he did all of the translating. And the first thing I said, I noticed that your names are different, because one was this really long name, and his son's name was just a 3-letter name. And I was looking at the other names on the clipboard that I had to go and interview, and they were all short. And I said, tell me about your name. And his son leaned towards me and said, oh, he has a really interesting story about his name. And I thought, isn't it your name too? You know, I knew it was his dad. And so he began to translate this story of how his father was put into jail twice and then finally into prison. And he was in prison for over 4 years, and altogether over 4.5 years that he spent in either jail or prison, simply because he was a Christian and because he wanted to share his faith in Christ. And he said, I don't like to talk about that time. It was very hard. It was a very hard time. What he didn't share with me is that I knew that he led many people to Christ in prison. And God worked incredibly. Those are stories I won't share today. But he said it was a very hard time, but God was with me. And then he shared about how when he got out, people would see him and they would mock him, because they'd say, what, you're still a Christian? You were in prison for 4.5 years because you served this God, and you're still a Christian? And he would say, well, yeah, I am. And he said other people would see that and they would say, tell me about this God that you serve, because I wouldn't do that for my gods, So tell me about this God that you serve. And he said, he's not just my God, he's your God. And he'd start right at the beginning of creation, and he'd just, tell them how this was their God and what his God had done for them. And there was an old man who was a Christian, and he saw this man, and he said to him, now we have seen the victory of the gospel.
Oh my.
Now we have seen the victory of the gospel, because you have spent time in prison, and yet you have come forth just even stronger in your faith. And this man, who had been in prison for 4.5+ years in a communist country, went and legally changed his name to, his first name, his last name, and he added on to his last name, victory of the gospel, in his language. And he shared some of the most incredible stories. But what it really came down for me, and I want to just share with our viewers, we live in a country where we still have religious freedom. If I share with my neighbors, they may or not be interested in Jesus, but no one's going to haul me off to jail.
Yeah.
I've had some worries as a Christian or as a pastor, but I've never worried that someone was going to come to my door and take me to jail. And it really made me think, what is it that we can be doing to support and to nurture and to encourage the persecuted church? And Lisa, I know there was something that when we were in a close country together last year, really impressed you. And that was really on just how forgotten sometimes people can feel.
Before we get into that, and I want to go right back to that, but I want to, what's put you in these positions is ASAP Ministries, ASAP Ministries. And I wanted you to introduce us a little bit to that ministry, and then we'll return to that.
Well, ASAP Ministries stands for Advocates for Southeast Asians and the Persecuted. And our focus group are 4 different people groups. We reach the unreached, those in the 1040 window, the poor, the persecuted, that's what we're talking about today, and then refugees.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we have over 600 national missionaries in a number of different countries, many schools, thousands upon thousands of students that mostly come from Buddhist or animist background, and yet they're in a Christian school learning
Right.
about Jesus. So much more that we could tell you.
Yeah.
You know, we talked in one of our earlier episodes about the humanitarian efforts that we do.
Yeah.
But it's a beautiful organization that really is supporting frontline work with national missionaries that
Right.
are sharing in their own language with their people.
All right. And you mentioned the 1040 window. Can you briefly tell us what that is?
Oh, I need to memorize this, but it's the part of the world. If you look at a globe, it's the segment that goes around the top of the globe, between 20 degrees and 40 degrees, that is largely non-Christian.
Okay.
So, particularly if you look through Africa, the Middle East, then over into Asia, that whole area is some of the places that we go to, it's less than 1% are Christians.
Okay.
Plus, it's heavily populated.
Right,
It's
so
like
heavy-
most of the people are there.
Many people
Yeah.
that have never heard the
Right.
name of Jesus. And that's really, some of those places too is where it is the most persecuted.
Right.
Yeah.
Either from different angles, whether it be political or other religions that are really persecuting the Christians.
All right. And so ASAP Ministry focuses on this area, but it's a
Yes.
humanitarian focus where you're going in and you're meeting very specific needs.
Yeah.
And while you're doing that, through the Christ method,
Yeah.
you're telling people about Jesus and giving them the opportunity to learn.
That's right. And since we're talking about the persecuted, ASAP Ministries, to my knowledge, is the only Adventist supporting ministry that's specifically targeting and helping the persecuted
Okay.
around the world. So those who are persecuted for their faith in Jesus. And they can really feel, forgotten.
Yeah.
They're in this area where they may not even, there's countries that we work in that I could never go in. If we do training with them, they have to come out of the country.
Okay.
And we would have to train them out of the country because it would be way too dangerous for me to go in. We were in a country that is very repressed and still a closed country, but we could still go in and do
That's right.
humanitarian work and meet with our brothers and
we
sisters
didn't
there.
We didn't feel that.
Yeah, we didn't feel threatened.
No, and we didn't feel the oppression necessarily. But even since that time that we were there, we have gotten like newsletters and stuff, updates from the leaders in that country who we know, and they will, they'll say, this church of ours suddenly, they've decided you guys aren't having any electricity. You're not. We're cutting this off. I mean, they just go and they just cut these people off from stuff, and nobody can do anything different with it. And those people, it's really easy for them to feel like they are forgotten.
Sure.
Like our family members in other parts of the world, they've forgotten us. And the way we realize that we can really help them know that they are not forgotten by us is how we support their local, ministries and projects that they have going. Because, you can only imagine the need that they have for some of their church buildings. They're pretty rustic. And for instance, in our last segment that we talked with you, we talked about 120 people being baptized into a church. Well, they said, we can't even let our kids come into the church now. We had to make like a little awning outside for our kids
Like
to
this
be
big lean-to. I mean,
yeah.
it's twice the size of the church now.
That's right. For them, the kids to have their church service outside because the adults, nobody could fit.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So now they're having to try to expand it.
Yeah.
And there was at another church that in the same country that we had not been to, hadn't visited, they had 100 people be baptized.
Yeah.
So this country, even though it's under persecution, it's like God is just exploding
Right.
the work, even during COVID when
Yeah.
it was shut down. And that's
Yeah.
pretty interesting how that kind of happened. And I'll say that quick because
Yeah,
you've
please
got
share.
some
Please share.
you've got some exciting stories to share. But during COVID, this country, I mean, they don't have the computer system. They do not have the Connect like we do because it's communist. And they decided, well, we've been thinking we need to make some videos and get into this media, but we don't know what we're doing. But anyways, we're going to try to do it. And this was when COVID hit because they couldn't get to their churches
Right.
and to their leaders. So they sent like a little video clip. It was like a homemade video clip
Oh,
from
so basic.
25 years ago in our eyes. And yet, as they were doing these things just as much as they could, sending these out over the airwaves, like people who were in lockdown in that country started just looking at anything they could find on the TV and they locked in on them. And it was like an evangelistic meeting that started happening in that country.
And that they could never have done
Yeah,
because it's
they-
actually illegal
Yeah.
to do, like they could never do an evangelistic
No.
meeting and invite the whole community.
Right.
It has to be that they're, doing it a little bit more under wraps, right?
And so God it was just exciting to hear what he was doing in a closed country during COVID.
Yeah.
It was just exciting.
Yeah,
So-
and we see these barriers as obstacles
Yes.
that, well, we can't do it. But God is able to take terrible things that happen
That's
in
right.
this world and still spin it around
That's right.
and allow
He's
it to do
amazing.
something unexpected and beautiful.
That's right.
Well, we are seeing the Lord say, it's time for these countries.
Yeah.
I am going to do something. They need to have an opportunity to hear about me because I'm coming soon. I love them too.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
our help, the way we help is just by sponsoring somebody.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And this is something that so many families or a church or a school
Yeah.
could take on, that they could say, we'd like to support a national missionary through asapministries.org, and we'd like to support them to work a whole year. Maybe I've met some people actually here in Oregon, talked to them on the phone, that as I've looked back at what they've given through the years with ASAP Ministries, they've been supporting 1 or 2 national missionaries for years and years. And I just think, what an incredible impact that has on these countries. What an eternal difference it's going to make.
Amen.
So I would encourage you to look it up. Find a missionary that you could support.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a quick break. I'm just blessed to be speaking with ASAP Ministries with Lisa and Lisa, and we're going to share some more stories and tell you a little bit more about how you can get involved right after this.
Better Life Broadcasting is a viewer-supported Christian media ministry that offers streaming programming via apps on various devices. Please visit blbn.org to support Better Life or to get more information. And don't forget to like and subscribe.
Welcome back to Better Life Today. I am joined by Pastor Lisa Eisensee and Lisa Budd from ASAP Ministries. And we were sharing some stories about how God is God and doing amazing things in these persecuted countries. Let's go right back into that. You had some more stories to share.
I want to share a story that was shared with me my first time meeting someone who'd been severely persecuted for Christ. And I think about, when you think about 4.5 years in prison, this is not 4.5 years in our prisons.
Right.
I talked to an older woman in this country just a couple years ago, and she told me about how she was in prison for a while. And she said every day I would see them come out with another person that had died. Every single day she'd see them come through past her cell to bring this person out. That's a very different kind of thing than is experienced even in our prisons in the United States. And so this man had been through this and became an incredible worker for God. He not only led people to Christ in prison, but when he got out, established much of the of the work, many people that in his people group can trace their coming to Jesus back to this man.
Churches.
Yeah. And he shared me a story that had just happened to him, and he was showing me the videos of it. And he said, through his son, he said, I was sent to a new area, my wife and I, to start a new church. Now, they had built thriving churches in these other places. And some people didn't even think they should be sent to this other place because, why not keep them there?
Right.
But they said, yes, we'll go. And so they went to establish a church in a community that had no Christians. And this man would walk back and forth every day from his home to the market to get their food. There wasn't refrigeration, you had to get your food every day. So he'd walk on this trail to the market back and forth. And on this trail, there was a house, a hut, that he knew something weird was going on there. And he asked about it, and they said, well, the woman that lives there is demon-possessed. And her husband was demon-possessed, and he died. And she will just go crazy certain times every month, and would just run around and do awful things. And they said, finally, the authorities told her family, if you don't do something about it, we will. And so they didn't know what to do. And so they brought their daughter, their sister, she was a mother of 5 children, and they brought her to her house and shackled her by her wrists and by her ankles to the post, one of the posts of her home. And so this pastor, Victory of the Gospel, was every day going past her home and, hearing her and praying for her. And one day he said, he'd been praying for a long time and he just felt the Lord's freed her. I know the Lord's freed her. And so he went to the family and he said, please let her go because, I've been praying to my God and he has freed her. I know he has. And they said, well, sometimes she acts in her right mind, but then she'll just get crazy again. Right. We know she's possessed. And this is one thing that we see a lot in these countries because they know there is demon possession, but they have no way to handle it. They have nothing to do about it unless they know that there's Christians in that village. And so he just finally convinced them. They said, the only way we'll let her go is if you and your wife will take guardianship of her and her 5 kids.
Oh my.
Now talk about a serious commitment and liability that they were taking, trusting that the Lord truly had freed this woman from demon possession. And he said, that's fine, we'll do that. And so they actually went in and got the keys to unlock her. And if I remember correctly, no problem unlocking her wrists, but she had been already locked up so long that the shackles on her ankles had rusted shut. And so they had to saw them off. And they sawed these off, and he took her home to his family, her 5 kids, and every day just studied the stories of Jesus with her. All week long, they just studied the stories of Jesus, and he knew she was free. And I think it was just maybe a week later that they went back to her home, scrubbed it top to bottom, prayed over it, and she's been there since, coming every Sabbath to worship the God that freed her from demon possession when nothing else could help her except Jesus. Mm-hmm. We hear these stories all the time. In fact, in this country, they say that about half or more than half of the people that come to Christ come in through answered prayers and miracles. Yep. Because they have seen, they have seen God do something that cannot be explained any other way. It's incredible.
Right. There's another story about, and I'll mention it quickly, about a young man that was demon possessed, and they chained him to a tree because he would hurt people when he went crazy, and so they just chained him. And sometimes he was normal, but he was still chained to the tree, and sometimes he was just screaming, yelling, hollering, and all this. And there was a group of young people, Adventist young people, who started coming to this village, and they heard this young man screaming, and they said, "What is this about?" And they said, "Oh man, he's got demons in him. You can't go near him." And they decided, we're going to that family. That's who we're going to go minister to. So they went to the family. They started doing, even though this young man was chained there, they did like Bible studies, talking with the father and the mother and this young man there in the hearing about God and about Jesus and about how he can set you free from this. And they did that every day until it was Sabbath. And they had told the family, now tomorrow is Sabbath, and they told them that on Friday, you bring him, even if it's in chains, but you bring you and your wife, and you bring him, and you come to the church. And they said, we're going to all pray for him. And they had been praying all week long with this family. And that next day, sure enough, that family showed up with this young man. He was like 15, in chains, came to the church, but wasn't even a week later. And the whole family knew that God had set this young man free. And he was free. You know, like, it's amazing what God is doing in these countries.
It makes me think of the four friends who bring
Yeah.
the kid
That's
and
right.
through the roof, just leading somebody to Jesus when it doesn't make any sense. But adopting a family into your home, and you're right. What was the risk there? If you think about it globally, if that doesn't work, that shatters your reputation in that area. I mean, there's so many issues, and God just breaks through. And that we're put into these positions and given these opportunities to do something that just absolutely makes no sense. But it's transformational, not just for us, but for those around us.
And you know, it's really transformational. And I get a little teary when I think about this, because there's nothing that I want more than for my 5 children to be in the kingdom, to know Jesus, to love Jesus, to serve Jesus. And I praise God as I see him working in their lives so beautifully. But in Pastor Victory of the Gospel, all of his children are in the faith. They saw it lived out in an incredible way. And you know, I never thought to ask his son, who was the one translating, what was it like for you when you were a child? And so this last time when we were in this country, he was one of our translators, and we had a lot of time. Yeah, he's actually the youth director in that country now. Young man, probably in his 20s, maybe early 30s at the most.
Something like that.
And I asked him, how old were you when your father was put in prison for that last time where it was so long? And he said, I was about 4.5, 5 years old. And I said, what was that like for you? And he started sharing stories with me. And he shared about how, he said, first of all, we had just learned about Jesus in the refugee camp in a different country. And then we had to come back to our country. And so we knew hardly anything, you know, I mean, just what we had learned for that short time that we were in the refugee camp. And even though my dad was sharing Jesus, we didn't know very much. He didn't even know very much. And he said, my mom, for instance, she only knew one song, one Christian song. And she said, I just remember her singing that. And we had to go to a village where we had some relatives. And that, you know, my mom worked hard all day out in the fields, you know, as a rice farmer, growing for her family. He would do so much work as a little boy, you know, from 4.5 or 5 to 9, you know, in that time spread. And he shared about how the people in the village said, don't talk to those children. You know, they'd say to their children, don't talk to those children because their father's a convict. He's a criminal, he's in prison. They'll be a bad influence on you. And so he said most of the children wouldn't even play with me, wouldn't talk to me, you know, wouldn't do anything. And he said there were 2 boys who did. One was my cousin, and one was just a little boy. He said, I don't know if his family was more open or if he just decided he was going to be my friend, but those were the only 2 that were my friends during that time. And he said, I called him to make sure I had some of the details right before I told this story previously. And he said, I forgot to tell you part of the story. He said, the village always ran out of rice by the end of the season. And he said, our family during those years my dad was in prison was the only family that didn't run out of rice. He said everybody else would be scrounging in the jungle and maybe they had some corn, and we would be the only one that had rice. He said God did a miracle. every week we had to take our little dogs and go to the barns where we stored all of our rice. And we would go to those barns and we'd chase out and kill the rats that were in the barns. And that was our job as kids. And he said, in our barn, in all those years my dad was in the prison, we never saw a rat anywhere close to it. And I just think about that story, and I just think how the angels were probably, you are not allowed to go here.
Yeah.
Now, this man went back to that village just this last summer, and the man who was kind to him is now a Christian, leading a group of Christians in that village, and now studying the Bible with this pastor.
You know, when
Just incredible.
Yeah, and when I think of that story with the rats, I think not only did God supply their need with food, but he spoke to that little boy that I will not even let rats come here.
Right.
You know, I am.
He was there
I'm
for
your
you.
God. You know, I'm here.
I'm
for
your
you.
father.
I'm your father.
That's right. And God is here for us too.
Amen.
right.
He's here for each of us. And through hearing these kind of stories and how God is alive and well,
Yeah.
but there are also people that are in much different situations than we are, that are being persecuted. And I'm thankful to be able to talk with you, to get to learn a little bit more about ASAP Ministries. Folks, please visit their website. What is their the website?
ASAPministries.org.
Okay. And learn more about it. God has something he wants you doing, whether it's participating in this ministry, working with your neighbor. Be open to where he is leading you. Be part of this movement, because we want to all go home.
That's
And we want to tell our friends, our neighbors, people across the world about what he is doing in our lives. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time on the next episode of Better Life Today.